Georgia's only president, Jimmy Carter, was laid to rest in the rural corner of southwest Georgia where he was born 100 years ago.
But first, Carter was remembered at the state capitol as a groundbreaking governor who declared that the era of discrimination in Georgia was over.
A giant pine tree has fallen in the state of Georgia forest, and for that, I'm humbled and a little emotional today.
Then for 60 hours, Carter lay in repose at the Carter Presidential Center in Atlanta, the engine of his productive post-presidency promoting democracy and public health.
But just know that while we mourn my grandfather's passing, I know in my heart, and you all do, that his legacy will live on.
More than 23,000 people came to pay their respects.
Just thinking about all that's happened in my own life since I was that little girl, I was thinking about all that's happened in the world since then. Just felt really touched by getting to see him one last time in that kind of way.
And finally, after lying in state in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, Carter was eulogized by one of his successors at the National Cathedral in Washington.
Jimmy Carter did justly, loved mercy, walked humbly. May God bless a great American and a dear friend and a good man.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Sam Gringlas reporting from Plains, Georgia.
I'm WABE Politics reporter Rahul, Bali reporting this week from the Carter Center in Atlanta.
And this is Plugged In, a WABE Politics podcast.
Sam, Happy New Year and welcome to 2025.
I cannot wait to see what's in store this year. You know, we ended 2024 with a last splash of breaking news with the passing of former President Jimmy Carter just before the new year.
And all week we've been following the events from Plains to Atlanta and D.C. Sam, you spent some time Sunday at the Carter Presidential Center after dark.
Yeah, Rahul, for 60 hours, the Carter Center was open around the clock, with Carter lying in repose under the watch of a military guard of honor. You know, I had heard stories of people coming late at night to pay their respects, and I wondered what that was like. So on Sunday night around 10 p.m., I headed over to the wooded campus near Inman Park.
Coming at night makes it really quite different than the daytime. It is very dark where his coffin is, and it's draped with the American flag, but because it's dark out, it's just spotlighted.
That's longtime Carter Center staffer Laura Newman, who volunteered during one of the night shifts. She told me that many people have found the late hours serene and more intimate, and Rahul, she said she felt that way too.
My quieter moment was tonight with my daughter as we went through to see President Carter. He's really meaningful to our family, not just because I worked with him for 25 years, but because he helped bring my family together.
The former president helped Newman with her daughter's adoption, and the Carters were among the first to hold baby Isabel when she finally arrived in Georgia from Guatemala. I also met Marcus Williams, who had come outside after observing the changing of the guard at 11:30 p.m. And Williams told me that in 1976, he was a young soldier stationed at Fort Leonard Wood. And that fall, he cast his first vote for president, and it was for Jimmy Carter.
It felt spiritual. It was moving, to say the least. It brought back a lot of memories.
Outside the Carter Center, a thick binder was filled with pages of tributes from visitors. And just before midnight, I found Emily McDonald hunched over the book, filling half a page with her note. McDonald grew up near the Carters' hometown, and she even met them as a kid.
I was writing about just how incredibly impactful it is for me to be able to see someone from such a small and easily forgotten and glanced over part of the state truly changed the world.
And Rahul, Emily McDonald told me that she actually works in the mental health field, which is a cause that the Carters championed, and she hopes that in her own way that she can help carry on their legacy.
So, Sam, I then came for the departure ceremony on Tuesday morning, but, like some of those folks, I actually came in the middle of the night, too. I went at about 4 a.m. and completely understood what those folks were saying. it was maybe 10 to 15 people walking through the museum and library. I got to pay my respects to his casket alone. And, it was, as you would say, kind of an intimate experience in paying your respects. Then later that morning, on Tuesday morning, was the departure ceremony, and that was held in the Circle of Flags. That's a circular driveway that's a little ways up from the library itself. Carter's casket was brought out to the music of an Army band from Fort Jackson, South Carolina. They played Hail to the Chief, Blessed Assurance, and Amazing Grace. This was all witnessed by Carter's family, led by Jason Carter, his grandson, who is really taking the mantle at the Carter Center. Also in the driveway, a group of employees and volunteers who were really braving some bitterly cold weather to pay their respects.
And then Thursday afternoon, Carter made a final trip home to Plains. And Rahul, that's where I'm talking to you from right now. Carter's motorcade passed through the little downtown here on this cold but gorgeous winter day. Friends, neighbors, and visitors lined the route. Some gathered for a service at Maranatha Baptist Church, where Carter taught Sunday school for years. A military flyover could be heard overhead. And finally, Carter was laid to rest near the modest ranch home he shared with Rosalind for 6 decades.
Sam, tell me about what it's like to be in Plains. This is a place so closely linked to the Carters.
So Rahul, step inside with me to the Plains Trading Post. This is one of the longest operating businesses here on Main Street. The owners are Philip and Ramona Kurland. You walk in and there's just a sea of buckets of political buttons and memorabilia for campaigns long since suspended. I asked Philip if he had a favorite.
The one that says, "Gimme Jimmy," because I feel everyone should say, "Give me Jimmy." So that's my favorite.
Kurland says it's been hard to watch politicians on TV talking about how well they knew Carter.
He's our neighbor. He's the one that prays with us. He's the one that shows up at every meeting. And we're saying to ourselves, you might know the political Jimmy Carter, but we know the real Jimmy Carter.
Kurland says Plains has been preparing for this moment for a long time. On the days Carter taught Sunday school, that would always draw the biggest crowd to his store. But Carter hasn't taught in a few years, and people have still been making the trek to Plains, and he thinks they will continue.
His spirit will always be here. He is our hero, Rosalind too. But let's face it, it's just not going to be the same.
And that's because, Rahul, like you said, Plains and Carter are inextricably linked.
The Carters are Plains and Plains are the Carters, right?
That's Jennifer Hopkins, lead education ranger at the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. We met up Wednesday, the night before the funeral, in the living room of Jimmy Carter's boyhood farm in the tiny hamlet of Archery. A fire was on in the fireplace, and one of the things I wanted to ask Jennifer about was what it's been like to be a historian at a place where for so long the main character has not only been still living, but living right nearby.
Yeah, it's definitely surreal. The previous park that I worked at, there were several times where I thought, if I could only talk to this person about what they wrote to figure out, what did you really mean, And for so long, we've had that access. But then there's also added pressure because you know that he's kind of not really looming over, but he knows what's happening. You want to do right by them. You want to make sure that you are being true to their legacy.
Hopkins told me for her and her colleagues, this week's kind of been like a funeral for a family member. There's the initial shock, then the business of running around to prepare. She told me she's walked 50,000 steps a day.
And then once all the visitors go away and you have that moment of quiet, that's when it truly sinks in and you have to take a pause where we feel a little lost. But then after that, that's when our training comes into play.
And eventually, Rahul, the Carters' home here will be open to the public too. The latest addition to a town that is in some ways frozen in time, but until now has been the site of living, breathing history. And now, for Jennifer Hopkins and her colleagues at the Park Service, the work is to keep that history alive.
So, Sam, I watched the state funeral at the Carter Presidential Center back here in Atlanta in one of the library theaters with a group of visitors. And it was mostly quiet for the funeral. From time to time, you'd hear laughter from one of the stories. One of the tributes that did jump out at me was from Stuart Eisenstadt, who served on Carter's campaigns and was a White House advisor.
As we lay our 39th president to rest, It's time to redeem his presidency and also lay to rest the myth that his greatest achievements came only as a former president. The test of American presidents is not the number of years they serve, but the duration of their accomplishments. By this measure, Jimmy Carter was among the most consequential one-term presidents in American history.
And he went on to name a few of those things.
Underappreciated at the time, but now widely recognized by Republicans and Democrats alike. President Carter was the great deregulator, winning legislative battles to loosen the regulatory bonds and shackles on airlines, thereby democratizing air travel, on trucking and rails, therefore helping our supply chains be more efficient, telecommunications leading to the cable TV era, and even the beer industry.
Eisenstadt also called Carter as close to a Renaissance man as someone who's been as president, noting that he was a farmer, nuclear engineer, naval submarine officer, Sunday school teacher, and so much more. And, you know, Sam, even though Carter has been out of the White House for more than 40 years, I think historians are still going to be trying to figure out what his final legacy as president is going to be.
So you mentioned his legacy as president. I've been thinking a lot about his legacy here in Georgia. You know, as we've been talking about Carter's upbringing here in Plains as the son of a segregationist peanut farmer, where his playmates were the children of black tenant farmers. And I was struck by this story during the National Cathedral funeral today from Ambassador Andrew Young. He said during the civil rights era, he was actually scared to drive through Plains. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called the county sheriff one of the meanest men in the world.
And when I first met Jimmy Carter running for governor and said, the only thing I know about Plains and Sumter County is Fred Chapel. And he said, oh yes, he's one of my good friends. And that was the last thing I wanted to hear.
But in this eulogy, Young called the South a place of miracles and said Carter really embodies that. Of course, Carter, when he was inaugurated governor in 1971, shocked his conservative supporters when he declared the time for racial discrimination is over. And I think helping Georgia on that journey will be one of his greatest legacies.
So thanks for your reporting in Plains, Sam. Let's take a break here. When we come back, we'll preview the 2025 legislative session, which begins next week.
Welcome back to Plugged In. Rahul, one of the rituals before session starts is this press conference with the House Speaker. John Burns carried on the tradition, went in front of the press on Wednesday. You were there. What did you learn?
That's right, Sam. Traditionally, this is held on the Thursday before session, but obviously moved because of the Jimmy Carter ceremonies. More than 30 journalists packed the anteroom just off the floor of the Georgia House to hear from Speaker Burns.
So before we get started,
he spoke for about 30 minutes and then took questions for about 20 minutes on a wide range of topics. Let me give you a couple of noteworthy things that jumped out at me. First of all, he raised some issues about the implementation of Georgia's new voucher program. Now, that was the legislation that passed last year, signed by the governor, for implementation of this program this coming school year in the fall. Now, our reporting was that the intent of the program was to give $6,500 per student vouchers to kids who were in schools that were in the bottom 25%. Well, when the Georgia Education Savings Authority wrote the rules, it included students residing in an attendance zone of a public school that's on that list. Now, here's what that means. A student in an elementary school that's not in the bottom 25% could be eligible if the middle school it feeds into is in the bottom 25%. Burns said that was just not the intent of lawmakers.
That it didn't apply to a system with one school failing to entitle any child in that system to be eligible for a voucher. It applies to a singular school because quite frankly, it's not fair to those other schools that are high achieving schools then for their students to have to be able to leave too, because that could cause a concern there.
Now, an analysis by the Associated Press finds the rules as written expands the pool of eligible students to more than 400,000. The current funding projection is around 22,000 for the 2025-2026 school year. Burns says, look, they're going to act if necessary.
Hopefully rules, after some discussions between now and that day, that when they're finalized, that the legislative intent will be recognized, and that's how the rules will be drawn. If not, then we'll have to do what we need to do in the House to make sure we get it right. Because that number that would be eligible would be very substantially, cost a lot of money.
Now, Sam, this is going to be very interesting to watch, as this was something that barely passed the House, and there are going to be some competing interests on multiple sides on this one.
Rahul, I know the speaker covered a lot of topics over that nearly hour-long session. What else jumped out to you?
So, Sam, this is not new, this idea of codifying into law protections for IVF. Here's what Burns had to say on that.
We know that there's some rulings in the legal system, in our court system in some neighbor states that have clarified some issues. So we want to make sure that every family in Georgia, every couple that wants to take advantage of IVF can do just that. And that'll be one of our priorities we'll do as well.
Now, Burns there referring to a ruling in Alabama that led to an interruption of IVF services in the state. I do wonder if there is a looming fight there, as there are some of the conservative movement who will not be on board. And this could be something that Democratic votes would be needed for. Sam, there were so many other topics that Burns talked about: transgender kids in sports, prison funding, school zone cameras, lawsuit reform, so many other things that we're going to be talking about over the 40-day session.
Okay, so that's the House, but there are, of course, two chambers of the Georgia General Assembly. We also expect to hear at some point from Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones about his priorities and also the new Democratic leadership. Rahul, who's in charge across the aisle now?
So let's start with Senate Republicans. In the past, we've seen, the Senate GOP caucus do a press conference. They release their priorities. Lieutenant Governor Jones has joined those in the past, along with, kind of doing his own deal, sit-down interviews. So that's something we're looking forward to here in the next week or so. One thing to remember there is Lieutenant Governor Jones likely run for governor next year, and how that plays into some of his priorities. As for Democratic leadership, both chambers have new leaders, with House Minority Leader Carolyn Hughley and Senate Minority Leader Harold Jones. And while on most issues, Republicans have the majority to do their agenda, there are those areas that Democratic votes could be needed, like efforts to expand gambling. So it's going to be interesting to see their leadership styles and what they move on during the session.
Rahul, talk me through the schedule and what to expect over these first few days of the session.
Well, Sam, we have the traditional kickoff event. That's the Wild Hog Supper on Sunday night. It's a big old shindig, and what you would expect, there's a big old hog on the table that's been cooked, and there's also all the fixins, and a lot of folks seeing each other for the first time in a while, and for the past decade, this has been a fundraiser for regional food banks. Then we have the first day of session on Monday, a lot of pomp and circumstance. And then we really do get down to business. Early Tuesday morning, we'll be at the Georgia World Congress Center for the Georgia Chamber's Eggs and Issues Breakfast. Look, this is a big deal. You have players in politics and business all in one room. This has been a place where governors and other leaders have made news and rolled out major proposals. Later in the week, Governor Kemp is expected to deliver his State of the State address. Again, a place where we've seen Governor Kemp roll out new proposals. Now, we also expect to see Governor Kemp's proposed budgets for 2025 and 2026. Remember, the governor starts the budget process, and lawmakers generally have to work within that framework.
So much to follow, and we will be on top of all of it. Stay tuned for more coverage of the start of the Georgia General Assembly next week. And remember, if you've been a listener of the Gold Dome Scramble podcast in the past, all of that in-depth reporting and analysis will now be right here on Plugged In.
Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick. Deputy managing editor Molly Samuel helped coordinate our coverage this week. on the passing of former President Jimmy Carter.
Keep up with what's happening under the Gold Dome at WABE.org. Have a great weekend.